There is a version of the Darcey and Georgi story that most people have already decided on. She was desperate, he was using her. The whole relationship was a transaction dressed up as a romance. That read is not entirely wrong. But I think the Aaron Carter chapter of this saga gets flattened into a punchline when it is actually one of the more genuinely strange and sad stretches in 90 Day Fiancé history. Because when you put the pieces together, the off-screen allegations, the tell-all walkout, the speakerphone meltdown, what you are really looking at is a woman who had built her entire public identity around being in love, and who was willing to absorb almost any humiliation rather than watch that identity collapse on national television. That is what I want to talk about today. Not just what happened, but why Darcey kept choosing this, and what the Georgi situation actually reveals about how the show, and frankly the audience, interacts with certain cast members. I'm going to be upfront about a few things before we get into it. Some of what Aaron Carter said about Georgi was made publicly, in his own words, in videos he posted himself. I will treat those as his stated claims and not as established facts, because I was not there and neither were you. What actually happened between Georgi and Melanie Martin is something I genuinely do not know. What I do know is what was documented on camera, what was said publicly by people involved, and what the pattern of behavior looks like when you line it all up. I will be clear throughout about when I am analyzing documented events and when I am just giving you my honest read. So let's start from the beginning. Or at least from the point in this story where things stopped being a normal, messy reality TV relationship and started being something a lot more complicated. Darcey Silva has been in this franchise longer than almost anyone. Most viewers know her from her years with Jesse Meester and Tom Brooks, both of which ended badly, and both of which she processed partly on camera. By the time Georgi Rusev entered the picture, Darcey was carrying a reputation that the show itself had helped build. She was the crier, the one who wanted love so badly it scared people, the one whose family kept saying, "We're worried about you," while she kept saying, "You don't understand him like I do." Georgi came in as something different, at least on the surface. He was older, had his own presence, seemed less like a fan who had stumbled into fame, and more like someone who understood the game being played. He was charming in interviews. He knew how to say the right things about wanting a future, about understanding what Darcey had been through, about being the stability she deserved. Whether he believed any of that is, honestly, something I cannot tell you with any confidence. What the cameras did catch pretty consistently was that Georgi had an active social media presence that involved a lot of women. Not in a way that was ever fully proven to be anything more than networking or thirst for followers, but in a way that made Darcey visibly uncomfortable, and that her family, particularly her father Mike and her twin Stacey, kept bringing up as a reason to pump the brakes. Darcey's response to those conversations was almost always the same. She acknowledged the concern, defended Georgi, and redirected her anxiety outward. The family was being negative. They didn't see what she saw. They weren't giving him a chance. That dynamic is worth keeping in mind because it explains a lot about what happened when Aaron Carter entered the conversation. Aaron Carter, who passed away in 2022, and who I want to be careful about how I discuss here, was a public figure who had his own very turbulent personal life that was also often documented publicly. He and a woman named Melanie Martin had a relationship that was widely reported on, including an engagement. When that relationship broke down, Aaron Carter posted content publicly, in his own voice, making allegations about who Melanie Martin had been speaking to. And the name that came up, the claim that he made, was that she had been in contact with a man from 90 Day Fiancé. The name he connected to that situation was Georgi Rusev. I want to be precise about what this was and what it wasn't. Aaron Carter made an accusation. He was angry and hurt and posted about it publicly, which was consistent with how he often processed things in that period of his life. Whether Georgi and Melanie Martin actually had any kind of relationship, romantic or otherwise, I do not know. What I know is that the allegation was made publicly by someone with a significant following, that it attached Georgi's name to a cheating narrative, and that it landed in the middle of a season where Darcey was already on television defending this man to her entire family. That timing is genuinely brutal, and I do not think it gets talked about enough. Darcey was on camera, week after week, telling her dad and her sister and anyone who would listen that Georgi was different, that she knew who he was, that the concerns were overblown. And then this happens publicly, in a space where the 90-day audience was already watching and already had opinions. She could not pretend she hadn't heard it. Her cast was talking about it. The fan forums were absolutely on fire. Her response, from what was visible publicly and on camera, was to minimize. To say she knew the truth, that people were stirring things up, that she and Georgi had talked and she was comfortable. That is the Darcey playbook, and she ran it here like she had run it with every other piece of uncomfortable information that had surfaced over the years. Now, here is where I actually want to push back a little on the framing that a lot of commentary on this situation uses. The easy take is that Darcey was naive, or in denial, or just desperate. And I think that undersells what was actually happening. Darcey had been in this franchise long enough to understand that doubt and suspicion are the currency of the genre. She had watched herself get edited into the grieving, desperate woman for multiple seasons. She had seen how the show frames certain cast members and how audiences run with those frames. My reading is that at some level she had decided that showing doubt, showing cracks, would just confirm a narrative about her that she desperately did not want to confirm. Defending Georgi was also, in a weird way, defending herself, which makes what happened at the tell-all even more significant. For anyone who needs a refresher, the tell-all for this season was a reunion episode where cast, exes, and relevant parties were supposed to come together to hash things out in front of the cameras. It is, without any exaggeration, the highest-stakes televised moment in the 90-day calendar for the people on the show. It is where receipts get pulled, where unaired footage surfaces, where everyone has to account for what happened. Georgi did not show up. He was not there. Darcey was sitting on that stage, surrounded by other cast members and the host and a studio audience, and the man she had spent an entire season defending was somewhere else, choosing not to be there. What happened next is one of those reality television moments that is difficult to watch, even if you do not particularly like the person it is happening to. Darcey called Georgi on speakerphone, on stage, in front of everyone. She wanted him there. She wanted some version of his presence, and the call was put on speaker so the whole room could hear. What Georgi said on that call, in words that are on tape and that I am paraphrasing because I want to be accurate rather than sensationalize, was something along the lines of not wanting to deal with the drama, not wanting to sit there while her exes, Tom and Jesse, were being discussed, and expressing frustration about the whole situation. He was audibly irritated. He was not comforting. He did not soften his tone for the fact that his girlfriend was on a stage being publicly embarrassed. Papa Mike was backstage and the cameras caught his reaction. Eye rolls, visible frustration. And then, in a talking head, he said directly that he did not believe Georgi loved Darcey. That is not me editorializing. That is what Mike Silva said on camera. Stacey, Darcey's twin, and the person who probably knows her better than anyone alive, described Georgi's absence as a massive red flag. Not a yellow flag, not a concern, a red flag. Stacey has been by Darcey's side through Jesse, through Tom, through every version of this story, and she was saying clearly that this behavior was not okay. Darcey heard all of it. And then she did what Darcey does, which is absorb the hit, reframe the narrative, and keep going. My honest take on the tell-all moment is that Georgi's behavior that day was genuinely difficult to defend. I have heard people argue that maybe he was nervous, that the show creates artificial conflict, that he had legitimate reasons for not wanting to sit there while her exes were present. I am willing to consider all of that, but none of it fully explains the tone of that phone call. You can decline to attend something. You can be frustrated. You do not have to be condescending to a partner who is sitting in front of a camera trying to hold it together. The way he spoke to her on that call, with that edge in his voice, was not the way someone talks to a person they are genuinely trying to protect. What it looked like, and I will be clear this is my read, was someone who had decided that the show was no longer useful to him in the way it had been, and who was not particularly concerned about managing the optics of his exit from Darcey's life. Now, I want to be fair, because I think this situation is more complicated than just Georgi is a villain. The show puts people in impossible positions. The 90-day format rewards drama, rewards suspicion, rewards the idea that something shady is always happening. Georgi was never going to get a flattering edit if the producers had already decided what his storyline was. And the Aaron Carter allegations, while public and made by a real person, were made in a context where Aaron Carter himself was going through an extremely difficult time personally. I am not saying the allegations were false. I am saying that the circumstances around them were complicated, and I think it is worth acknowledging that before treating them as settled fact. The sunk cost dimension of this is also something I want to talk about honestly, because I think it is underanalyzed. By the time the tell-all aired, Darcey had invested not just emotionally, but in terms of her public positioning. She had vouched for Georgi repeatedly. She had fought with her family over him. She had brought him into the franchise, into the audience's awareness, into the whole ecosystem of her public life, admitting at that point that her family had been right, that the concerns about his online behavior were valid, that the Aaron Carter situation should have made her stop and ask harder questions that would have required her to publicly reckon with a series of decisions that she had made on camera. That is an enormous ask for anyone, let alone someone who had already been through multiple public relationship failures on the same platform. So instead, she doubled down. She talked about their future. She talked about love being worth fighting for. She talked about not letting outside voices destroy something real, and whether there was anything real left to destroy at that point, I genuinely could not tell you. The people who criticize Darcey most harshly tend to frame her choices as weakness or delusion. I do not think that is quite right. I think she had developed a survival strategy for being a public person in a format that chews people up, and the strategy was to never let the audience see her give up. The problem with that strategy is that it requires you to keep defending things that are increasingly indefensible, and eventually the gap between what you are saying and what everyone can see becomes too wide to maintain. The Aaron Carter chapter accelerated that gap considerably, because there was an allegation that came from outside the show's ecosystem entirely. It was not producers editing her unfavorably. It was not her family projecting their own anxieties. It was not jealous fans making things up. It was a public figure making a specific claim about a specific person, using his own platform. Darcey could not control that narrative the way she might have been able to control something that happened inside the production. There is also a layer to this that I think is genuinely sad and that I want to mention without turning it into something dramatic. Aaron Carter is no longer alive. He passed away in late 2022, and a lot of the things he said and posted in the period before his death were made when he was clearly struggling. I do not know how to weigh his allegations in that context. I do not know whether to treat them as the truth of someone saying what he actually knew, or as the output of someone in crisis who was lashing out publicly. Probably it is not one or the other. Probably it is both, in some combination that I am not equipped to parse. What I can say is that referencing his claims without acknowledging the full context of who he was and what he was going through feels incomplete. What I believe at the end of all of this is that the Georgi and Darcey story is not really a story about cheating. It might involve cheating. It might involve some version of what Aaron Carter described, but the actual center of it is something more structural. Darcey had spent years building a public identity around romantic love, and the show had spent years monetizing that identity by putting her in situations where it could be threatened. Georgi fit into that machine perfectly. He was attractive and charming, and just ambiguous enough that you could never quite pin him down. He gave the show exactly what it needed, which was a season's worth of, "But does he really love her?" energy. And then, when that stopped being useful, he stopped showing up. Whether that was calculated on his part, I do not know. I am not going to tell you Georgi Rusev had a master plan. I do not have evidence of that, and it would be unfair to assert it. What I can say is that the outcome of this relationship followed a pattern that the people around Darcey had been warning about from the beginning, and that Darcey, for reasons that are at least understandable even if they are frustrating, could not bring herself to take those warnings seriously until they had already played out. Her father said it plainly. Her sister said it plainly. The audience said it. The fan forums said it. And in some quiet corner of herself, I suspect Darcey already knew it. Knowledge and action are different things, though. Knowing something is probably true, and being willing to let it change your behavior are not the same. That gap is not unique to Darcey Silva. It is one of the most common features of being a person. I think what makes this particular chapter worth examining seriously, rather than just laughing at, is that it happened in public and on a schedule. The cameras were rolling. The audience was watching. Every moment of her sitting with information she could not fully process was captured and broadcast and dissected. Most people get to fall apart and recalibrate privately. Darcey had to do it in front of millions of people, with producers shaping the narrative around her and an audience that had already decided what kind of person she was. That is genuinely hard. I can think she made bad choices, and also recognize that those choices were made in a context most of us will never experience. Where this leaves me is here. I think Georgi's behavior during the tell-all was indefensible, regardless of what was or wasn't true about the Aaron Carter allegations. I think the allegations deserve to be treated as unresolved, rather than as confirmed fact. I think Darcey's pattern of defending people past the point of reasonableness is a real thing that contributed to how this played out. And I think the show itself, the format and the incentives of the franchise, made all of this more damaging than it had to be. The thing I keep coming back to is the speakerphone moment, because that image, Darcey calling a man who could not be bothered to show up for her on speakerphone in front of a live studio audience, contains something true about this whole situation. She was trying to bridge a gap that was not bridgeable. She was trying to make someone present who had already left, and everyone in that room knew it except, or maybe especially, her. That is not just a 90-day fiancé storyline. That is something a lot of people recognize from their own lives, which is probably why it hit so hard and why people are still talking about it. The circumstances are extreme, and the platform is absurd, but the feeling underneath it is not. I do not know if Georgi was faithful to Darcey. I do not know what really happened between him and Melanie Martin. I do know that a man who genuinely cared about his partner would have shown up that day, would not have spoken to her the way he did on that call, and would have understood what it cost her to be sitting on that stage without him. Whether that absence was the result of cowardice or calculation, or just a general indifference to her feelings, it told Darcey's family and the audience everything they needed to know. The argument was over. The only person still making it was her.